All right, welcome back. Yes, we're joined by Professor Adigun Agbaje, who is the visiting professor and director general, Dr. Sikiru Kaide Adetona Institute for Governance Studies, Olabisi Onabanjo University, Agoiwe. He's been there since 2021. He is a professor of political science, University of Ibadan. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
Good morning. My pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you deal with governance matters, you study that, you're in political science. I'm sure you're quite interested in how leadership plays out and all the associated factors and consequences, as it were. So from what you've seen, how the country is going about this, because we're in that period again, what strikes you?
What strikes me is that it is still a major challenge for us as a people to actually deliver on democracy, a democracy that is meaningful to the people as well as to the elite. So it's a daily struggle as we try to actually put in place democracy. Of course, we know it's a process. It's always a work in progress. There is nowhere that democracy is fully delivered. But I think we're still far below the path. And that, I think, is a challenge, especially for the elite, because leadership matters, but also for the people as a whole. So it's a daily struggle precisely because we have not actually delivered on democracy. But of course, as people say, there is probably no other alternative to a democratic dispensation.
Perhaps you could just, I mean, when they say that people are products of society, the ivory tower, so give us a bird's eye view of what happens, in the four walls of the ivory tower where you are. What kind of theories, studies, what knowledge, leadership ethos do you try to communicate to the students where you teach about governance? What happens there? What do you tell them?
Well, we tell them exactly what I've just said, that all of this is a process, but we are so far behind what is expected of us. We bring evidence from history to show that, perhaps if we don't get too focused on the moment, we'll realize that there was a time when Nigeria had appropriate leadership and a larger measure of democracy, respect for the rule of law. And that to the extent that it has actually happened before, we don't have to lose optimism by also thinking that it can still happen. Because things can really get depressing. But we tell them, don't become prisoners to the present. Look at the history of your country. It has been a glorious history. Look at even the present. Don't be consumed by the message that everything is bad. There are pockets of effectiveness. There are pockets of good leadership. There are pockets of good governance, both in the private and public sectors of life. What is required is that we increase the resources that we can use to now build on all of that experience and all of that history and all of that present moment that is positive. And then we can actually move forward beyond all the drama of the elites that is not strategic in terms of its commitment to democracy, that tends to be very short-sighted. And in terms of the people that have literally been decoupled from the democratic process, we tell them about all the complexities of moving forward to democracy and good governance and good leadership. But we also tell them that it will be very simple when you look at the right places and you engage the right people. So of course, all of these is reflected in our teaching and also in our research. But as you know, the resources for research are also problematic. And many of us have to depend on foreign foundations. Increasingly, rich Nigerians who are able to are beginning to fund research, but they tend to focus more on action. But without the knowledge base, action can produce not what we expect in terms of moving forward. It can actually produce situations in which we are moving backwards.
Okay. Well, Prof, just one moment, if you don't mind me butting in, to quickly ask you, when you say that we have had an experience where we got our democracy right, which of the republics are you talking about? The first, the second, the third, or this one, 23 years into it?
Yes. If you look carefully at our history, part of the problem is that we have neglected our history. Even under the later part of colonial rule, as we began to prepare for a transition to independent nation, and the first few years of the First Republic, like up to 1962, we had what we can describe as meaningful democracy. A democracy built on people, political parties built on people, political parties that were run from the party dues that were paid, people committed to their political parties that were not empty, literally. Look at the institutions. Our federal system was very strong. And then we had, federal military government, which really is a contradiction. And then we had civilians steeped in impunity, a large measure of disdain for the rule of law. And then we still said we have democracy. So when you look carefully at the history, you see resources with which you can teach your minds to say that. The same thing in the Third Republic, the Second Republic. The first few years of the Second Republic were marked by struggles to expand the spaces for democracy, struggle to strengthen our federal arrangement, struggles to actually strengthen our Republican, impetus. So yes, that's what I mean. And I can speak more to that. Let's not create the wrong impression that Nigeria has always experienced undemocratic rule. That is not the case.
Perhaps that also, my apologies, perhaps that also speaks to the question Chamberlain asked about what do you teach, the students. And I want to ask that perhaps the same question in this different way. You're a professor of political science, and I'm just wondering, what is it in politics that the politicians fail to see, know, or learn that has brought us to where we are? You must have listened to the previous conversation when we're asking, a major politician, what interests are there in politics when we say politics is a game of interest. Is that an ethos in political science?
Well, it's a question that I must situate in the Nigerian experience. There is nothing wrong in politics. But there are all sorts of things wrong with those who run politics in Nigeria. I've mentioned this creeping culture of impunity at all levels. And when I talk about politics, I'm not talking about just national or state politics about deciding those that will govern. I'm talking about politics everywhere. And I'm talking about leadership everywhere, not just political leadership. It's a major challenge. We have reconstructed or we have decided to emphasize the more negative tendencies in politics. Competition for us is a matter of life or death. Leadership is not strategic. I want to emphasize that that's a core challenge to politics, politicking, and governance in Nigeria. Leadership is generally not strategic. And when leadership is strategic, the strategy is about negative things, holding on to power, It's not about addressing the fundamentals of Nigeria. The whole challenge and promises of unity, development, peace is going to a level that competition now has popularized the whole idea of using, violence to negotiate. I mean, in other places, that would be an impossible. How do you negotiate with violence or the threat of violence? That's the kind of thing that our elites have created, to the extent that some researchers and writers all over the world are saying that the major problem of Nigeria and Nigerian politics is the elite. Perhaps in that sense, a large chunk of the people are ready to move forward faster than the elite are. The elite are just too interested in furthering their own. With due respect. And I say that advisedly as a student of politics since 1976. It's amazing how we are frittering away our opportunities to make Nigeria to come to occupy the place it deserves, not only in Africa, but in the world. A country of over 200 million black people, with all the resources at its disposal, with all the human power that we have, making waves all over the world. And then we have an elite that cannot see, with due respect again, beyond its nose, cannot see the extent to which it is not in the interest of even the elite to continue with the kind of politics they are playing. They are playing with the future of Nigeria. Of course, we know that they are also playing with the present. And so it is our bounden duty, as academics, as professionals, as citizens, to always use every opportunity to tell them that, look, what you're doing is not right. You may be benefiting in the very short term, but the whole country is bleeding. And what are you doing about it? I think that is it. There's nothing wrong about politics. In other places, their recruitment pattern enables them to bring out the best. Now, increasingly, with due respect to our elite, people are saying that, is it not the case that the people that have taken over our political space are actually one of the number one problems of the Nigerian people? That is where we are now.
So, part of the challenge in us trying to get the best people, have a system that produces the best people to run the affairs. Some identify that's why they subscribe to that school of thought, which says that our ivory towers are idealistic when it comes to those political ethos and teachings and ensuring the political minds have the best kind of information to go out there, as opposed to being realistic in the sense that these days, politics is expensive. There's poverty. People pander towards some of those immediate gratification, and then for the next 4 years, they wait for that same cycle. And they go further, saying something is wrong, because that's why you have some professors who are returning officers end up trying to rig elections, falling to the same narrative for which they accuse the elite. And so how do we then connect the dots?
Like I said earlier, at times we think that the problems with Nigeria are complex. They are not. In a sense, they're very simple. I've been a professor since 1998. Permit me to be personal. My take home is 416,000 naira. That does not, of course, justify people leaving the ivory tower. And I think we are having court cases that are actually confirming that this happens to help to rig elections. It does not, but in any system, there will always be, marginals. In the US system, in the British, there are marginals. What they do is to make sure that they keep the mainstream safe from all these negative things. But in Nigeria, the mainstream is the one that is really totally unsafe. The marginals have taken over. The quote-unquote criminals have taken over. And that is the challenge that we have. But I must also make a point. I'm a comparativist. I study politics across countries and cultures. It is not the case that poverty always translates into undemocratic behavior or corrupt behavior. India has been able to maintain, like I said, the mainstream, largely free of some of those influences. Of course, in the marginals, poverty is a major problem. But in the mainstream of Indian life, among other countries, poverty has not subverted democracy. We must draw the right lessons to say that, yes, poverty is a challenge in Nigeria, but can we construct a future where even when there is so much poverty, we can secure a more democratic system? Some of the people that are running our democracy down are making it almost so difficult for us, in spite of all our resources, to develop. And not poor people. They are some of the richest people. So empirically, there is a challenge there. And that's what we do as academics. We must think in unusual manners, look for the evidence, and support a system or a movement to make Nigeria democratic, to make Nigeria a developed country, to ensure that ethical codes of conduct, that we go back to those. In the past, if there were conflicts of interest, you declared it. Now you build everything, even policy, around conflict of interest, and nobody is saying anything. So that is part of the challenge we face. How do we render the Nigerian narrative in a manner that is not distorted, in a manner that is not about lying to ourselves and lying to the people? Because a lot of things are bandied around that are actually lies, and we assume that these are iron laws that ensure that we are going to be trapped. This is not the case. We need to begin to construct our narratives, to emphasize those things that unite us, to emphasize those things that are still there and are potentials for real development, rather than regurgitate what our elite are saying, which, whether they know it or not, are actually making it more difficult for us to reach Nigeria's destiny as a leader of Africa and as a developed country with wonderful people who have the capacity to turn the world around, not just their country around. That is a challenge for us, not just as academics, but also as citizens, as professionals. And I hear professionals talking all the time. And they are saying the right thing.
Well, it's certainly a challenge for everyone, as you've rightly pointed out, Prof. Yeah. If I may come in here, I'd like to ask you about this campaign. Oftentimes, usually before elections, we will always see this drive for registration of new voters. INEC started the process last year. And CSOs have taken it upon themselves to see how they can engage the youth bulge. Now, just a few days, 2 days ago, the former governor of Lagos State, who is currently a minister at the federal level, celebrated his birthday, and he had a colloquium. And one of the things that came out of that was what to look out for when, electing leaders. And one of the things that he said was that anger was not a strategy. Oftentimes, it will seem that when elections approach, it's usually assessment time for the party in power at whatever level. It is a time to see whether or not they've done well. And more often than not, it's about whether or not they will be rewarded for how they have governed or how they haven't governed. When you listen to a number of young people on the reason why they're purchasing, or not purchasing now, why they're getting their voter card, a number of them are dissatisfied with what is currently going on, the current state of affairs of the country, and as such, think that, getting a voter card will be the way. I do not know if you think that somehow the process of democracy doesn't give us many options, and that it's a somewhat emotional process rather than one that actually brings about rational outcomes?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question to raise. It's been shown all over the world that over the last decade or two, there has been a rise in anger. So it's not something peculiar to Nigeria. So anger, rage, if you like. But the studies have also shown that you cannot construct something positive on the momentum of rage and anger. Rage and anger have a role to play when you operate within a political system that is so stifling of democracy. A political system that has witnessed the opening up of the political space in a major manner in the last decade or two, but that has also allowed anti-democratic elements to now occupy those new spaces, perhaps more than the democratic elements. So it's a challenge. I agree entirely. There's a role for rage, there's a role for anger, perhaps even violence. But quickly that has to be transformed into structures, into institutions for democracy. It doesn't have to be within a governmental sphere. And I must say that civil society, much of civil society has to be commended for how far we have gone along the path to positive, to meaningful democracy. And increasingly the youth are waking up. Of course, the youth ban is also a challenge in itself because there are also anti-democratic elements. The fact that the youth doesn't mean you struggle for democracy. There are those who are seeing themselves as successors already, or in fact, they are already becoming successors to the current state of affairs, which is negative. But again, a lot of the energy, some of us have argued over time, that we need to transform Nigeria will come from the youth, and they are already coming from the youth. The whole process now is to emphasize organization, and I must also commend INEC. The technology, the changes we are witnessing in the technological sphere is bound to make our political processes more open and more inclusive. It's already doing that. We saw what happened in the state in terms of course, there were reports of vote buying, but then, of course, there was also progress. You know, progress is incremental in this kind of situation. Because seriously, I don't want to be accused of elite bashing, but they need to be told that for every new technology, for every new development meant to make our electoral process more meaningful, it's like what we used to say when people still say, there is the people that made pencil that also know how to deploy erasers. So when people keep on talking about reforms in terms of new legislations and so on, who are the people making the legislation? And what do they benefit from? Are they benefiting from increased democracy, or are they benefiting from the fact that we remain backward as a nation aspiring to democracy? If their interests lie in not giving us, or not ensuring or frustrating democratic impulses, can we trust reform on them? Can we trust them to do the right reform? So these are the questions we have to begin to ask and to encourage people, young and old, to commit or recommit to a better Nigeria and find ways, if you like, if it is required, to build a quarantine around some of the more difficult elements of the elite so that this country can move forward. It's unfortunate. Look at all the resources we have. Our people are making waves all over the world, and yet we can hardly do anything meaningful. So I think the technological developments have to be welcome. The democratic impulses among the youth must also be welcome and commended, that despite all the sacrifices that have been made in the past, including, the sacrifice of life, the youth, the significant portion of the youth are still committed. I think I would say that the future of Nigeria actually, in a really meaningful manner, in terms of recrafting the Nigerian space for real democracy and real development will lie more on the non-state actors rather than those who purportedly now govern us. It's only if we can find within them.
Is it enough for the youths to be involved? Prof, if I may, is it enough for the youths to be involved after primaries have been conducted? Don't you think we need to see more young people within parties trying to effect changes from within?
Absolutely. Engagement is a major platform. It's a requirement for democracy. There must be engagement, and we must encourage not just the youth, everybody, including academics, including farmers. You see, the problem with one of the major problems, if I may say that, I don't like emphasizing problems, but the problems are there. And we must understand the problems before we can begin to actually meaningfully address the solution. The problem now is that the Nigerian political space has been crafted to ensure that the larger majority of the people are decoupled. They are separated from their own political process. And there is a complex to that, you know. In the FCT itself, we were conducting some study around I think, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we discovered that there were communities in the FCT that really needed real four-wheelers, not the pretending ones, the ones that pretend to be four-wheelers, to access in the FCT. I used to do research in the Niger Delta, the oil-producing areas. And we were always amazed when we went on Warri River to focus on company boats, but we were working for multinationals then. And the absence of any infrastructure. Maybe you have a boat that comes a week, water was dark, no tap water to drink, no fish, children will dive to the bottom of the water to catch shrimps. And the first thing I asked myself, how do INEC people get here without the support of multinationals with their helicopters and so on? Transportation is a key element in democracy. Infrastructure is a key element. I mean, there are African countries that have been at war, and when you land in the airport, you have free internet access immediately. These are major issues. People don't know that, infrastructure, transportation, communications, they are about access. And when people don't have access, what do we say? So we must begin to tie all these together so that we don't put too much pressure on the victim. We must first create an enabling environment, or begin to think about how we can do it so that we can have an enabling environment, not insist that you must pay 100 million to be president and 50 million to be governor. That is ultimately self-defeating. But of course, that's when we assume that our leaders actually want democracy. But when we assume they don't really want democracy and we have to take that from them, then we begin to understand the logic. And we stop blaming the youth, why don't you get involved, when in fact infrastructure for getting involved. And of course the value systems also. Our leaders are too much still in entitlement politics. They are too much, they are not, with due respect, there are those among them, as I said earlier, there are pockets of democracy, pockets of effectiveness, both in public and private life, even in some of those institutions that we note for being corrupt, that you find a few of the officers that are doing very well. So we must always put that footnote there. But we must focus on the ball, and it is about creating the environment for the youth who are very well, mobilized, who I think probably understand the challenges that we face more than those who govern us, who have been governing us for decades, and they're just repeating all these things for which Nigeria remains where it is.
All right, we'll anchor at that point with Mr. Adigun Agbaje, who is a professor of political science, University of Ibadan. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, we're back in a moment. Don't go away.